Today we're going to talk about 7 ways that Indonesia and Malaysia are different from each other. Indonesia and Malaysia are 2 countries that have a lot in common. They're both located in maritime Southeast Asia, also known as the Malay archipelago. The Malay language has historically served as a lingua franca throughout both areas, and large parts of both countries were ruled by the same empires in the past, the Sriwijaya Empire and the Majapahit Empire. The people of both countries use the historical name Nusantara to refer to the archipelago. They also share the island of Borneo, along with Brunei. But as the title of the video suggests, there are numerous differences between the 2 countries. Number 1. Indonesia has a much bigger population, an estimated 277 million people as of 2022, while Malaysia's population is around 34 million people. That means that Indonesia's population is more than 8 times greater than Malaysia's. Indonesia is the 4th most populous country in the world, after China, India, and the United States. Malaysia is the 44th most populous country, give or take 1 or 2 places, depending on the exact measurement used. Number 2. Indonesia is much larger. Indonesia's larger population isn't so surprising considering the country's larger size. Indonesia has a total area of 1,904,569 square kilometers, while Malaysia has a total area of 329,847 square kilometers. That makes Indonesia about 5.8 times the size of Malaysia. But Indonesia also spans a huge area because of the space between its major islands. From east to west, it spans 5,150 kilometers, making it big enough to span the entire continental United States. And then some. Compare that to Malaysia. Number 3. Economy. Indonesia has a much bigger economy than Malaysia. In 2020, its GDP was roughly $1,058 billion. In the same year, Malaysia's GDP was about $337 billion. That means that Indonesia's GDP is 3.14 times the size of Malaysia's. But remember that Indonesia has a much larger population than Malaysia, so Malaysia's GDP per capita is higher. It was $10,412 in 2020, while Indonesia's was $3,869. That makes Malaysia's GDP per capita 2.69 times higher than Indonesia's. This is an oversimplification, but that basically means that Malaysia has a higher standard of living, at least in terms of material wealth. Number 4. Colonial history. Both are former colonies, but Malaysia is a former British colony, while Indonesia is a former Dutch colony. Beginning in the 17th century, both the Dutch and the British were establishing forts and trade posts in the Malay Peninsula and archipelago. To settle disputes over which country controlled certain areas, they signed the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824, in which they decided the boundaries of which areas the British would control and which areas the Dutch would control. This treaty between the 2 colonial powers determined the current borders between Indonesia and Malaysia. If there had been no treaty and all of the land became a colony of just one of those countries, then Indonesia and Malaysia might have been a single country today. Being former colonies of different colonial powers is a factor in several other differences between Indonesia and Malaysia. Number 5. They have different national languages. Kind of. Both Bahasa Malaysia and Bahasa Indonesia are based on Malay, but they have diverged somewhat over the past 100 years or so, and are now somewhat different, in particular in their vocabulary. In Malaysia, there are more English loanwords, and in Indonesian, there are more Dutch loanwords, as well as loans from regional languages of Indonesia, such as Javanese. So, for example, the word for bag in Indonesian is tas, which comes from Dutch, and in the Malaysian version of Malay, it's beg, which comes from English. Another difference is that Malaysians often don't speak Malay on its own. They mix it with lots of English words, and some words from other languages like Hokkien Chinese. These aren't really loan words, they're not part of standard written Malay, but rather people code switch in an improvised manner. Something similar happens with Indonesian, but the code switching is normally between Indonesian and regional languages like Javanese, Sundanese, and so on. But Chinese has also influenced some varieties of informal Indonesian. There are many more speakers of Hokkien or other varieties of Chinese in Malaysia than there are in Indonesia, because 6. The racial, cultural, and religious demographics of Malaysia and Indonesia are very different. In Malaysia, 69.4% of the population are Bumiputra, Malays and other ethnic groups who are native to the country. 23.2% are Chinese Malaysians, and 6.7% are Indian Malaysians, mainly of Tamil background. These are the numbers as of 2020. Chinese and Indian Malaysians in large part descend from laborers who were brought there by the British during colonial rule. In Indonesia, about 95% of the population are pribumi, native Indonesians, and official statistics state that only 1.2% of Indonesians identify as Chinese. The number of people with Chinese roots is definitely higher, but in Indonesia they have been more assimilated than the Chinese in Malaysia. In Malaysia, minorities are less assimilated, and the different ethnic groups have different cultural identities, different school systems taught in their respective languages, and political platforms represent the interests of specific ethnic groups, and so on. In Indonesia, this is not the case. There's mainly just one Indonesian school system, and while there are different regional identities and different ethnic groups, only one national identity is accepted: Indonesian. From 1966 until 2001, Chinese language and cultural celebrations in public were actually banned, which led to a high level of assimilation. There are also different religious demographics. In Malaysia, 63.2% of the population is Muslim, 18.7% is Christian, 9.2% is Hindu, and 6.1% are other. Those statistics come from the Malaysian government. In Indonesia, 86.7% of the population is Muslim, 10.7% is Christian, including Catholic, which is actually a separate category in Indonesian statistics, 1.74% is Hindu, and 0.77% is Buddhist. But anecdotally, I've heard various descriptions of Malaysian Muslims as being more conservative and a higher percentage of them being devout Muslims. Indonesian Muslims tend to be more liberal, and a higher percentage of them are nominal Muslims. But this is just what I hear from Indonesians and Malaysians. Number 7, the legal system. There's a dual legal system in Malaysia, with civil and criminal law, but also Islamic Sharia law being implemented to a limited degree at the state level. Sharia law applies only to Muslims and is applied for family matters such as marriage and religious observance. The punishments which can be given out by the Sharia court are limited to 3 years in prison, fines of up to 5,000 ringgits, and 6 lashes with a cane. Indonesia does not have Sharia law except in one province, Aceh, on the island of Sumatra, where it's applied much more fully and strictly than anywhere in Malaysia, and applies to non-Muslims as well, at least for things that are not covered under the National Criminal Code. The right to implement Sharia law was granted to Aceh as a special autonomous province as part of the peace process with the pro-independence Free Aceh movement. In the rest of Indonesia, secular law applies. Well, it's not 100% secular, as there are explicit references to God and religious values in the country's constitution, but that's meant to reflect the various religions of Indonesia, not only Islam. And Indonesia's current criminal code dates back to the Dutch colonial period. The Pew Research Center conducted a survey in 2015 that showed fewer Indonesians than Malaysians want their country's laws to strictly follow the teachings of the Quran. In Malaysia, 52% of the population said that the law should strictly follow the Quran, while in Indonesia, only 22% said that the law should strictly follow the Quran. Much of Indonesia's population does not want limits placed on its civil liberties. In 2019, the Indonesian government tried to pass a bill that would change the criminal code from the current Dutch one to an Indonesian one. A large portion of the Indonesian population rejected certain articles that criminalized behaviors like sex outside of marriage and insulting the president, so the bill was delayed. To be clear, that new law would not be Sharia law, but it would limit civil liberties, and many Indonesians don't want that. Malaysians, especially those of Malay background, tend to emphasize the things that Malaysia and Indonesia have in common, while Indonesians are more likely to emphasize that they are different and distinct from Malaysia. Maybe that's another difference, so I guess there are 8, not 7. But despite all these differences, and despite Indonesians and Malaysians' tendency to argue on social media, just like everyone else, they still share many historical, cultural, and linguistic connections that make them sibling countries. If you're from Indonesia or Malaysia, do you agree with the differences mentioned in this video? Are there any other differences you'd like to mention? If you'd like to support this channel and see videos 1 week early, click the join button next to the subscribe button to find out how you can become a channel member. And check out my video on Indonesia. It's really old and it's not very good, but I made the best video I was able to make at the time because I was excited to make a video about Indonesia.